Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about colonial resistance leading up to the American Revolution. So let's dive in. So when we're starting our story, we've been talking about the development of 13 colonies, the old colonial system, the relationship of mercantilism between the 13 colonies and Great Britain or England. And now we're talking about kind of following immediately after the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, whichever way you want to phrase it. We're talking about that changing in relationships. So 1763 is that big turning point in the colonies. Now, before we dive into the colonies themselves and the divisions, we got to talk about some political philosophy. So this is John Locke. He is one of the great political philosophers of England, and he is going to lay the foundation for what Americans are going to use to argue that Great Britain is doing wrong, that the British Empire is challenging. So it's kind of ironic that the United States is getting ready to create their own brand new nation, but we're using traditional British thought as the foundation for our arguments. So we're trying to be the best Englishmen we can, but that translates to us, in order to be the best, we have to break away from the British Empire. So there's some fundamental ideas from John Locke. First and foremost are the rights of Englishmen. So every natural-born Englishman has certain unalienable rights. Specifically, he has certain natural rights. Now, these natural rights stretch beyond any national borders. So the natural rights that Locke outlines are life, liberty, and property. So we kind of change that a little bit whenever we write our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. We talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we'll talk about that when we get to it, leading up to the Constitution and Declaration, all that kinds of stuff. But for now, we can kind of see the foundation of these ideas that Locke is laying down that the United States is going to begin latching onto in our infancy. Now, one of the big components is the social contract. Now, this is an agreement between the people being governed and the government doing the governing. So the idea is the people are willing to give up some of their rights. That could be, certain freedoms, certain expectations. They may not be able to own certain land. They may have to pay taxes. They may not be able to do certain things. But in exchange for giving up certain things like taxes or the ability just to do whatever you want, having to follow laws, in exchange, the government's supposed to provide certain things. Protection from foreign enemies, certain social controls or protections to help you thrive and grow, all these kinds of things. So when that contract is broken, this is what the colonists will start arguing, is that this contract, the social contract, has been broken. When it's broken, Locke lays down this idea of the right to rebel. That when that social contract is not being upheld, it's the people's right, not just their ability or that they should do it, but it is their given right to rebel against an unfair or tyrannical government that has broken that social contract. Now, not directly tied to Locke, but in the same vein of what we're talking about, there's this idea that Parliament, the British Parliament, is the Constitution. Unlike the United States, where we have today a written constitution that lays the foundation for our political kind of thought, Parliament was the Constitution. That means as the people in Parliament came and went, as they changed who was elected to Parliament, then that changed what Parliament believed, and the constitutionality, while England had a constitution, it was far more fluctuating than what we have in the United States. We at least have this basic document that works well to kind of point us in a certain direction, whereas the British Parliament, it kind of ebbs and flows with the tides of society. And this is what Americans had so much trouble with, because as things ebbed and flowed, we never quite knew what the rights of Englishmen, what our defenses within the British Parliament or the British Constitution actually said. Now, like we touched on last class and mentioned earlier today, you have the Treaty of Paris of 1763, which ended the French and Indian War and gave Great Britain a whole bunch of new land. So basically everything in yellow was given to Great Britain from France. New Orleans and Louisiana had been given to Spain before the treaty had been signed, so England could not claim the Louisiana territory. Now, because of things like Pontiac's War and Pontiac's Rebellion, because of colonists moving into Native American territory, the British issue what's known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, or simply the Proclamation of 1763, which drew that imaginary line along the Appalachian Mountains, dividing the colonists from the Native Americans. And all of this was designed to stop future war. The British had just got out of a war in 1763 that lasted almost a decade. Lots of debt. They didn't want to deal with more war, so the simplest way is divide the two warring factions. Don't let them interact. However, to pay down all that debt, even if we stop future wars, you still have the debt from the previous war. So the British are going to begin enacting a series of new taxes. Now, it's not that they're just punishing the colonists by giving them new taxes. The colonies had always paid far less taxes than British citizens back in the home islands had been paying for the past 150 years. And on top of that, a lot of colonists and various colonies skirted various taxes, smuggled, did a lot of things that weren't exactly in line with the various laws, including the Navigation Acts. So let's look at some of these acts and taxes and see how they affect the colonies and how the colonies react to them. So the first big thing is the First Quartering Act. Now, this is an act that says the British Army has the right to utilize any unoccupied building. So if there's a warehouse or any unoccupied, unused building that they could use for barracks or anything like that, they can then quarter or house their soldiers in those barracks. Now, we're not quite yet to the point of British soldiers being put in personal homes. So that's not on the docket yet. But we do have this kind of precedent of putting soldiers in unused buildings. Now, the bigger issue that the colonists have isn't so much the housing of the soldiers, but why the soldiers are in the colonies at all. During the French and Indian War, it made sense. The soldiers were here to protect the colonies from the French and their Native American allies. However, after the war, they assumed these standing armies would be gone. But now there's this new growing tension that we have these standing armies in the New World, in the 13 colonies, and the colonists don't know why they're here. If they're not here to fight a war, then they must be here, in many of their minds, to oppress American citizens, or at least British citizens within the 13 colonies. Then we have the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, it's also dubbed the American Revenue Act. Now, this was an act to regulate things like sugar and molasses, a valuable good within the empire, and it was supposed to bring a little bit of money into the British coffers with a small tax. However, any tax is going to make the Americans mad at this point, so they're already upset because they didn't get access to that land after the Proclamation Line. Now, the Sugar Act with the small tax is making them really angry. And then by dubbing it the American Revenue Act, it looks like this tax is targeted specifically at the Americans as a form of punishment. The Currency Act sets up a requirement that all British taxes paid in the colonies must be paid in what's called specie, or hard gold and silver coin, so the actual coinage made of valuable metal. If you're paying all your taxes in real coins, that means all the valuable precious metals are leaving the colonies, being sent back to England to pay taxes. So the colonies are stuck using local cash money, local paper notes. And this is not an ideal system because these paper monies only have value when they're in the city where the bank resides. So there's no nationwide or British-wide currency set up yet. You would take your gold and silver coins, put them in a bank, and then the bank would issue you local notes that you could use. But if you were in New York and you went down to Virginia, your New York money wasn't going to be valid in Virginia unless there was a bank that you could exchange your notes at. So this was becoming a big problem. It was depleting a lot of the hard, real currency from the colonies. Shortly after the Sugar Act, we get the Stamp Act. Now, what's crazy about the Stamp Act is the Stamp Act is just proposed and the first stages of implementation are beginning. It hasn't ever gone into effect. So when the Stamp Act is announced, they say on certain paper goods, we're going to have these stamps. You have to buy stamps on newspapers, governing or government documents, playing cards, all these kinds of things, mail. They're going to have stamps. You pay a small tax and you get your stamp and you can put it on there. Now, many colonists hate this, and in reaction, they will set up what are called the Stamp Act Congresses. And those are big meetings, kind of the first organized meetings all across the 13 colonies to begin talking about how can we resist this. Now, the colonists are going to resist in normal ways. They will write petitions. They will organize things like the Congresses to petition the government to oppose this. But as the first Stamp Act collectors, so the stamp tax collectors are getting hired, they're going to draw the ire of many of these angry colonists. And while some are content to petition and follow more legal routes, others take kind of less kind versions of resistance. So we have things like tarring and feathering, where you strip someone naked, pour hot tar, which will burn their body, then you cover their body with feathers, and you put them on a rail and ride them through town. This is not a pleasant experience. So they were getting these tax collectors and doing this to them, basically saying, if you want to keep this job, this is what we're going to do to you. To others, they would burn them in effigy. They would make kind of straw, scarecrow-like creatures and clothe them in these people's clothes and then hang them outside their house or burn them alive outside their house to send a message to these people. If you do this, if you take these government jobs, if you collect these taxes, we are going to beat you, we're going to hurt you, we're going to threaten your life and your family. So this is a very dangerous time. Now when the British government sees this, they're not particularly shocked by this. Peasants in England do this kind of stuff all the time. Whenever a new tax comes out, they expect some sort of anger, some sort of resistance. But in the colonies, it's becoming more virulent than ever before, more violent than ever before. Now, in reaction to all this resistance, all these attacks on the future the stamp tax collectors, the British Parliament decides to repeal the Stamp Act. So the colonists, throwing this big temper tantrum, get what they want. The British government backs down. And this means something to the colonists. They learn a very important lesson. If you throw a big enough temper tantrum, you get what you want. The British government will back down. However, at the same time they repeal the Stamp Act, they issue what's called the Declaratory Act, which basically says, yes, we're repealing the Stamp Act, but we have the right to pass any law and tax on you that you want, or that we want. So despite repealing something, they say we can do whatever we want in the future. Now the colonists don't learn that lesson. They kind of ignore the Declaratory Act. They only learn the lesson that if you throw a big enough fit, the government will back down. Now I gotta talk about another idea, virtual versus actual representation. So the British believed in something called virtual representation, where someone would represent the best interest of the empire. So Parliament would represent the best interest of all the various nations within the empire, and they knew what was best. Where Americans, we had gotten used to what was called actual representation, where we chose people from our local areas and sent them specifically to our local representative governments, which would make decisions for us. So we wanted people from our area to actually go represent us in our local government, and more importantly, we began asking for actual representation in Parliament. We want American representatives in Parliament, so Parliament would have our actual voice instead of claiming virtual representation. Then they try something called the Townshend Acts of 1767. So this is a whole series of acts set up to regulate various goods, trade goods, all kinds of different things. Now, it was supposed to be kind of tailored to regulating trade within the empire, so maybe the American colonists wouldn't be angry. But by this point, American colonists are angry just because they're angry. And we react very poorly. We began sending circular letters. We began opposing a lot of this. So basically, these are like chainmail kind of letters. You write your stuff, you send it to the next convention adds on to it, and it goes from colony to colony, everyone kind of getting and demonstrating their anger and frustration at this. Now, shortly after these letters start going out, this act is proposed and enacted, we start seeing the first big flare up of frustrations, particularly the first loss of life. So this is going to be the Boston Tea Party. Several citizens from Boston, most likely drunk on a cold winter day, go up to the customs house, the heart of where all these township duties are being collected, and they begin harassing the guards there. Now we're talking 50, maybe 100 colonists yelling, calling the guards names, and there's only about 7 to 9 guards active on duty at this time. They begin throwing snowballs at the guards, trying to provoke them. And this is the problem. When you begin throwing stuff at people with guns, it might go poorly. Now, snowballs were one thing, but they begin filling some of these snowballs with rocks and shells. Eventually, one of the guards will be hit in the head with a large rock. He will fall, his gun will discharge, and this causes a huge reaction into the crowd. People begin yelling. Some of the other guards begin firing. Very quickly, the commander stops the firing, but it's too late. 5 colonists have been killed. Now, the Sons of Liberty call this the Boston Massacre. So 5 people were killed in an accidental shooting, but that's not how they portray it. They ignore the provocations of the colonists and say, oh, these guards maliciously attacked and murdered these people in the streets. Blood was running down the gutters. It was a gruesome sight. And you can see from the wood print that they put in their pamphlets and newspapers. This is what they were selling to the American people. They were trying to get the American colonists riled up. But in the end, John Adams will actually come and defend the guards. And we'll get the guards off on a plea of self-defense. Finds enough evidence, there's still a fair trial capable in the colonies. And after this Boston Massacre, things do die down for 2 or 3 years. Things calm down, everything seems to be kind of getting back to normal, and then the British government tries a new tax. This is the tax on tea. And this is going to be a strange problem for the British. Because what happens is the British East India Company is struggling to make ends meet. The biggest trading company in the British Empire is on kind of weak financial footing. So the British make a decision. The British government says, we'll give you a monopoly on tea. And the monopoly has this weird result. It actually, even with the new tax on tea, the monopoly lowers the price on tea. So you would think the colonists would be excited to have cheap tea, because this is cheaper tea. Even with the tax, this is cheaper tea than ever before. And being good British citizens, Americans love drinking tea. However, simply having that tax on it, the principle of the tax, sends colonists into a frenzy. It's going to be during this time period that we start seeing Americans shifting over to drinking coffee instead of tea as well. Now we begin having a lot of committees of correspondence. So each colony will set up a committee. They'll begin writing letters to each other. How do we coordinate? They begin protesting and boycotting sugar and tea and various other goods to try to hurt the British system and force them to repeal the Tea Act. Then the Sons of Liberty make a decision as well. The Sons of Liberty get together and they begin to attack one of the ships in the harbor that has been not allowed to unload its tea. So the Sons of Liberty sneak through Boston Harbor, dressed as Native Americans, sneak aboard one of the ships, and throw millions of dollars of tea into the ocean. Now, the dressing like Indians wasn't a, true disguise. They knew no one would think Native Americans snuck through the whole of Massachusetts Bay Colony, the whole of Boston without being noticed. Everyone knew who these people were. Just everyone was like, I don't know who they are. I must have been some Native Americans that snuck in. But nonetheless, they did it, and the British government is going to enact harsh punishments upon Boston. These become known as the coercive or intolerable acts. So you get the Boston Port Act, which shuts down Boston Harbor until the debt for the tea is paid. So this cripples Boston Port because Boston is a port that's designed and makes most of its money off trade and shipping. So if the port is closed, the city is crippled. Then you have the Massachusetts Government Act, which disbands the Massachusetts Assembly, saying you cannot have a government if you cannot control your own citizens. You get the Justice Act, which says that any British official accused of a crime, instead of standing trial in the colonies where they are accused, they will go back to England to stand trial. The British do this because they feel that these representatives, these government officials, won't receive fair trial in Boston and other cities anymore. And then you get the Second Quartering Act. This is the really nefarious one that we see that the colonists really react poorly to. This is when British soldiers can start being housed in the homes of private citizens. So this is the infamous one that we all know about and we hear about as one of the major protests for the American Revolution, or leading up to the Revolution. Then we get kind of our first big organizations. We start having the first big meetings where a lot of the colonies are coming together. They're starting to meet, and we're starting to get our first kind of conventions between the various colonies talking about what to do. How do we do this? And they're talking about a lot of different things. No one's really saying independence yet. No one's really quite ready to make that claim of start a new country and do all this kinds of stuff. But we do have some people beginning to stockpile weapons, some people like the Sons of Liberties who want a war, that want independence. They're kind of the minority, but they are beginning to mobilize. So this First Continental Congress is coming together to talk about all of these things. What is our course? What is our path going forward? Now, this initial Congress writes letters to parliaments, petitions them, begs for Parliament to repeal some of these acts. However, after the First Continental Congress adjourns, some problems are going to erupt. The British are going to march some troops out to Lexington and Concord, where they hear some colonists, some of these Sons of Liberties, are stockpiling weapons, which the British cannot tolerate. So this is that famous story of Paul Revere when the British march out, leaving Boston, heading up north to Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere and other writers go and try to alert the various Minutemen, the Sons of Liberties, these sympathetic patriots for the American independence cause, to gather their guns and go meet and defend these two towns. And eventually, some of these colonists form up, and they do face off with the British. Now, we still don't know who fired first. It could be a guy that was hunting that morning. It could be someone who misfired on accident. We don't know if it was Colonial or British, but someone fired at one of these engagements. And it starts the first firefight of what becomes the American Revolution. Colonists will be killed, British soldiers will be killed, and the first blood has been shed of the war. This becomes known as the shot heard round the world, because the British Empire stretches around the world. So when we begin fighting, it triggers a war, not just amongst kind of a civil war within the colonies, but a world war as we begin pulling in allies, as the British pull in their allies and their colonies, and this erupts into a much bigger conflict than we ever thought. And this leads us to the next session of our Continental Congress, where we have to decide what are we to do. What is going to be this final push? Now at this Continental Congress, they decide to make one last-ditch effort, the Olive Branch Petition. So they write a letter to the King of England directly, to George III, saying, King George, we understand Parliament's doing these things. We appeal to you. Would you please help us? Would you please stop what is happening? So they write these letters, begging him, please help us. Please stop this conflict and this violence before it erupts into something greater. Now, the king does not respond, does not react in the way that they hope. And the Continental Congress is left in silence. And this is going to be one of the final breaking points that pushes the colonists to finally decide to go to war. Now, there's a few other political thoughts that we'll talk about in the next video that kind of push the majority of the colonists over that hill towards actually supporting the war enough to begin writing what we know as the Declaration of Independence today. So we'll stop there with this video for today, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.